Hello, I'm Wendy James, Communication Director of James Solutions Incorporated, and I'm excited to welcome you to our third 30-minute online panel discussion with the business improvement experts at OpExecs today. Last time we talked about how to gather and share the most critical data required to accelerate decision-making as companies emerge from this pandemic. And today we're going to talk about how innovation is driving profound changes in manufacturing. Mechanical and electrical processes are increasingly being managed by sensors, robotics, artificial intelligence, and other modern developments. Industry experts have called today's environment Industry 4.0, a term coined in 2011 at the Hanover Trade Fair by Bosch, a leading German engineering and technology company. I'd like to get started by asking Susan if you can tell us what we're seeing today about how innovation is driving change.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. This is such an exciting time to be in manufacturing. In fact, if I could go back to school again, I'd want to be an industrial engineer. There's so much change on the horizon. Technology and innovation are affecting everything about the production process and the supply chain. In fact, communication is one of the most important aspects that drives manufacturing excellence. Seems like it's a simple thing, but actually communication can be quite complicated when you think about the requirement to connect every party, every producer from raw material all the way through to consumer consumption. And what technology is enabling us to do today in a very new way is to connect that entire process to the internet, which allows us to understand the status of every piece of equipment, every supplier along that chain eventually. And it's that transformation that's making a huge change in manufacturing today. And in fact, the COVID-19 crisis is accelerating this for many reasons. One of the things that we're seeing in a lot of manufacturing is a difficulty in attracting entry-level manufacturing people into the organization. And we'll talk about how digitization and this fourth and fifth industrial revolution are enabling that. A new term that's come about that I think is a very good one is something called the supermind. And this is the idea that when we connect the human brain to digital information and technology, we end up with a much more powerful production process, a more powerful decision-making process and result that adds more value for customers at in a much more efficient manner.
Great, thank you, Susan. Can you tell us the difference? You mentioned digitization. Can you tell us the difference between digitization and digitalization?
Yeah, a little bit of a tongue twister there. So digitization is taking a physical form, whether it's a paper or a piece of information, and digitizing it, putting it into a computer. So every time we scan a document and we take a picture of it and make it available to a computer, that's digitization. Digitalization, or sometimes called the digital transformation, is all about taking pieces of equipment and technology and intelligence that we have from the way production processes or processes in general have been run before, and connecting all of that information in a way that's useful to people running the process. So it can affect everybody along the chain, whether it's an operator that's running a process and wants to know how efficiently their equipment is running. Is it running at design speed? To maybe it's a process engineer that's not even located where that process is and they can dial in remotely to help problem solve, to even manufacturing leaders and other suppliers along the supply chain that want to know the status of an operation at any point in time.
Great, great. Thanks, Susan. There's also a term, smart factory. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, smart factory is taking a production facility and connecting all of the devices, all of the equipment in that facility to the internet, so that the information about how that process or equipment is running is available not just to people in the facility, but people outside of the facility. It's a very involved project because you have to take your IT infrastructure and bring it up to speed in order to connect old and new equipment to the internet. It opens up a world of opportunity because now you're seeing information that previously you had not been able to see. So there's a whole lot of information that opens up for improvement and optimization, and lean can be applied in ways not possible prior. because of the connectivity of all these devices. And just because you're pursuing smart factory doesn't mean everything in your factory has to be connected to the internet. Even connecting certain processes or certain elements, companies are seeing a big improvement in productivity just by starting out in an area of their factory or in a portion of their supply chain.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Fidel, can you tell us what you're seeing in this, what we're calling the fourth or even fifth industrial revolution?
Yeah, so most would agree that digitalization results in productivity gains and efficiencies, which in turn drive down overall operating costs, mostly in labor and overhead. But while digital technologies do improve an existing process, it just can't do it on its own, right? At least not yet on a big commercial scale. And that's because there still needs to have a process or a system to be defined. When you can think of it like kind of like a box, right? Mm-hmm. Certain parameters are designed or programmed inside that box. So it's critical to understand that artificial intelligence is a tool for performing narrow set of tasks within a sufficiently controlled environment. And it's changing, but most second wave AI still relies on large scale statistical inference models using just a massive amount of data sets. But these applications are only reliable to the extent of the data that it was designed or within certain scenarios, right? So if the data is insufficient, or if the world has changed in relevant ways, then the data parameters may no longer be applicable for what it was designed. All right, so given all that, let me give you a real world example, right? I'm aware of a leading consumer goods manufacturer that invested several millions on what they expected to be a fully integrated, fully automated piece of equipment. It had a lot of logic, a lot of robotics. The expected output was roughly right over around 1,000 units per day. Yet 2 years later, it was running at half its intended target. And Wendy, we could spend the rest of this time here talking about all the issues, but I'm going to boil it down to two main issues that were at play in this scenario, right? The first was there was an unrealistic expectation where the robotics would operate on their own and resolve any errors that came along the way. So what happened is when something happened that was outside of that box, the system just wasn't smart enough to figure it out. So there was a need for human interaction that was not originally conceptualized, right? And then the second thing, changes in the marketplace. During the time that this whole system was being developed, customer tastes evolved, which were not accounted for in the system. So when a particular set of SKUs became more prominent, it just kind of highlighted those inefficiencies or deficiencies in the box, in the parameters that it was designed. So they just became, those errors just became much more prominent. So in reality, human interaction was in fact necessary to control some of these processes. So kind of in summary, the technology needs to be flexible enough to automate when the designs or the products change over time. The organization really needed to develop a specific skill set that could adapt and work alongside the computer technologies and not just rely simply on automation, but could have actually worked alongside the automation to augment the human capabilities that were involved or required.
Wow, that's a great example, Fidel. Thank you. So we have people on the call today. We have companies worldwide. They're looking at spending millions and millions of dollars on this technology, and they're looking to save costs. So David, can you tell us about some tools or ideas or experiences that would help these companies take the right steps to not waste money and set their expectation and invest the money properly for the biggest return?
Yeah, I mean, the knee-jerk tendency is to just dive in. And typically what happens is an executive will see some solutions that might be in place with some competitors or some peers. And they say, well, this will work for mine. And that's one of those things where one size doesn't fit all. You have to be really cognizant of the environment. And by environment, I guess what I'm talking about is not only the solution that you're trying to put in place. So you're trying to introduce technology, those types of things, but also the fact that you have staffing that has to be addressed. You have just the materials that have to be addressed. So yeah, you can automate a line all you want, but if you have to get materials there to feed that line, I mean, how do you handle that? How do you handle that whole supply chain ability? Because not everything is going to be automated. As Susan mentioned earlier, some things just aren't meant to be automated, and you need to rely on the resources you have. And you have these high turnover rates with folks that are on the lines, that actually impacts whether the solution you implement will work or not, because it drives your assumptions. And so one of the big things that you do is you take all these factors into play. So you make sure you have leadership support. You make sure they understand the problem, so you have a well-scoped statement. You make sure that when you're going off to kind of decide on your implementation, that you have a solid scope of work, that you know what you're trying to solve. Because even in Fidel's example, one of the things and one of the challenges is if you don't know what you're trying to do and you're relying solely on the vendor, then you're not really understanding what's going on. So you need to include the whole team. And so I like to use tools such as prototyping, and you can use that in the general sense of what you probably typically see. Like you'll see a car and you'll see a prototype of a car. It doesn't have all the functions. But I also think of this as mental prototyping. So actually walking through how you would actually implement that solution. And so you're actually using the operators, the people that do the work, and seeing how they actually perform in these. And there's different tools that you can use for that. Monte Carlo simulations, is what people use Excel sheets for. But now with the advent of like AI and those types of things, you're seeing things like augmented reality and virtual reality. You're just immersed in that scene and you're just walking the process as if it's real. And then you're making decisions based off of that. So prototyping, it's also good because we're now in this technology stage now that prototyping, you don't have to build everything. You can just build models. And so you can build artificial models, you can build virtual models, and you can do quick changeovers and say, okay, well, instead of this line using one piece of equipment, let's just sub in another equipment. We know how long it takes. We've used Lean and Six Sigma, and we've done a value stream map. And so we know that if we put this here, well, this is going to clog up this area. We can't fit that because the plan isn't big enough. So those are the types of things you can do. And you really need facilitation to do that. So it's not just the project lead that's doing the project. You need somebody that's outside of the scope of that. And that's where operational excellence and other things come in, where they're asking those hard questions. So it's not just a technology decision. And then you implement these things in bursts. You don't do everything at once. One of the things, one of the key terms we use now is agile. But all it really is build a little, test a little. And so that's something that I used to do in one of my former roles in a defense company, where we would just build something. And even you look at other customs, they just build things and you learn from building. But if you build enough little things, you kind of build the big thing in the end anyway. And the key thing is you have customer involvement the whole way. So that's always good. So I think those are some good decision tools. You have your traditional decision models, net present value, those types of things. Everybody knows how to do that. But if you keep all those folks involved, and then you make those Lean Six Sigma things where you're actually mapping the process and using the folks, you're actually going to have some very good opportunities, documented opportunities that you can measure against in the future.
Good. David, we just had a question come in from one of our participants, and she wants to know, do you find organizations are more apt to adopt the Agile model versus waterfall development models?
They say yes until they get into the weeds. So yes, do Agile, but give me documentation. And so one way around that I found is you do Agile to the different milestones. So you keep your same milestone approach, but you just do Agile in between those different milestones. So now you're getting the traditional waterfall, develop, requirements, development, implementation, but you're actually doing sprints within those where you're involving the customers. And so that way you're tracking, because if you know Agile, and I'm going to throw a technical term, stories. If you know how to build stories, stories are nothing more than just requirements. And so if I solve that story, which is nothing more than a value stream map, if I really want to get into it, a story is just saying, I'm going to have something do this by doing this. Well, that's value stream mapping, that's process mapping. So, I mean, I think that's how you kind of bridge the gap. But they may say they want it, but you have to show them how it translates to waterfall. You you have to keep those waterfall things in there. You have to make sure you have the documentation.
Good, good. That's a great suggestion, David. Thank you. So continuing on your examples, David, how will the innovations leverage a newly skilled and flexible workforce on what's being called the fifth industrial revolution or personalization?
It's basically relying on the new hires to give you some of those solutions, right? So we're never going to be experts at everything. The technologies are going to change. If you keep bringing in the right folks, you'll get more solutions and you'll get more innovation. But it does have to have some structure to it. You really want to make sure that you're taking and we mentioned Gemba walks. So we do Gemba walks from one standpoint to see how the process is going. But from the other standpoint is you're kind of pulsing the workforce and you're seeing how they interact. And so that's where a lot of those ideas come out. And so you're using that to kind of decide, well, okay, this is what they say they're doing. And oh, by the way, I have the data because I've done all this artificial intelligence, machine learning. I've done all this KPIs, all these Six Sigma things, right? I'm measuring their progress, but this is what they're saying. And this is what they're saying are impediments. So now I can gauge, well, maybe I can automate that because maybe it's so routine. Look, they're so stable. They're always hitting the same things. So maybe I can automate that. Maybe they like doing that. And so maybe I don't automate that. And it's just as expensive. And so maybe I keep it manual because it's something that they like to do in their task. And then the stuff they don't like to do, I kind of push that off to a computer. And that's kind of what you're constantly doing. You're pushing the stuff that's routine and mundane off their plate. And the stuff that may be routine that they like, you keep. And the stuff that's not routine, it's always going to be custom. Obviously, you have to use human intelligence.
Great, great. Thank you, David. Before we move on to Alan, our manufacturing operations expert, we have an add-on to the question about the agile model versus the waterfall model that you were talking about before, David. Does it help drive adoption? And our participant is guessing yes.
Yes. Yeah. One of the biggest downfalls of waterfall is wait until the milestone. And then you get into the milestone meeting and then it's a whole bunch of action items because everybody wasn't prepared. I'm saying the doomsday approach, but I mean, you can get into a meeting and everybody uses the meeting to make a design decision. With Agile, you're making design decisions on a weekly basis, monthly basis. So by the time you get there, it's just a formality. It's just trying to hit some of the things that they may not have caught.